We have to talk to Mr. Manafort.
It is a name heard more and more on Capitol Hill.
You're talking about Paul Manafort specifically?
I'm talking about Mr. Manafort.
This Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's former campaign chief, who is denying he has had anything to do with the Russian government, with Vladimir Putin, and with alleged Russian hacking of a U.S. election, and with any coordination between Donald Trump's campaign and Russia. But the Russian connection issue will not go away, largely because of this man, Viktor Yanukovych, a politician who eventually became president of Ukraine. In 2005, Paul Manafort says he began consulting with Yanukovych, advising him and his party through tumultuous elections that included a divisive campaign, allegations of corruption, voter fraud. Manafort is credited with helping get Yanukovych elected president of Ukraine.
The issues we should be talking about.
In an interview with CNN last year, Manafort says the ideals he brought to Ukraine were pro-U.S., and his job was focused on bringing Ukraine closer and closer to Europe and away from Russia.
As far as the Yanukovych administration is concerned, you will see, if you do any fact-checking, that I was the person that negotiated the framework, which is based upon which Ukraine is now a part of Europe. That was my role. That's what I did. And when it was completed, I left.
But Yanukovych moved closer and closer to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Yanukovych's policies divided the Ukrainian people, leading to riots, police killings. Dozens were shot to death, including targeted killings of Yanukovych's political opponents. Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych fled his own country to Russia and to the safety of his friend Vladimir Putin on February 22, 2014. All the while, he was continuing to be advised by Paul Manafort. Then there's this, a ledger identifying $12.7 million in possible surreptitious payments to Manafort from the Ukrainian political party from 2007 to 2012, and a newly released document allegedly signed by Manafort himself, which a member of the Ukrainian parliament insists is proof Paul Manafort was receiving illegal payments while working as a political strategist.
This fake invoice and fake contract signed by Paul Manafort, it's not about political consulting, it's about selling of computers by Paul Manafort to this shell company on Belize.
Manafort's spokesman says the signature does not belong to his client, and the ledger allegations against Manafort are false. So how did Manafort, just 2 years after his former boss fled Ukraine for Russia, come to the rescue of Donald Trump's campaign for president? Starting in the 1970s, Paul Manafort worked or consulted for 3 Republican presidents.
Speak from the heart.
He was a lobbyist, working with firms who represented repressive or military governments around the world that needed a friend in Washington. Somalia, Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, Jonas Savimbi in Angola. They were all clients of his firm. Also on the list, Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation and Donald Trump. In 1989 testimony before Congress on a separate issue, Paul Manafort was blunt about his overall job and his clients.
The technical term for what we do and what law firms, associations, and professional groups do is lobbying. For purposes of today, I will admit that in a narrower sense, some people might term it influence peddling.
But in March of 2016, Donald Trump needed a different kind of influence peddling, and his campaign tapped Paul Manafort as just the Republican insider the Donald Trump campaign needed to win over establishment Republicans to clinch the nomination. Paul Manafort was brought in to make the reality TV star and real estate developer appear more presidential.
I've known Donald since the 1980s, and we talked about it, and he felt I could help him as I felt, and he made the changes.
5 months later, Paul Manafort was gone. His troubled past in Ukraine was coming back to haunt him. As CNN first reported, the FBI was looking into possible corruption and money laundering involving Ukrainian politicians, including the work of Manafort's firm. Current and former U.S. officials tell CNN high-level Trump campaign advisors, including Manafort, regularly communicated with Russians known to U.S. intelligence, though Manafort called that allegation 100% not true.
Drew, in addition to all these other connections, Manafort, he's admitted he worked for Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska, who's supposedly close to or has ties to Vladimir Putin. Yet Manafort says there's nothing nefarious and he has nothing to hide. So when is he going to answer questions about all this?
And Anderson, when he answers those questions, will any of them be on the record, sworn testimony before the Senate or House Intelligence Committees that are looking into all this Russian election meddling? We only have a statement from Manafort saying he has instructed his representatives to reach out to committee staff and offer to provide information voluntarily regarding recent allegations about Russian interference in the election. That, Anderson, doesn't sound like testimony to me, and it still doesn't sound like he's going to appear publicly up on Capitol Hill.
And that also may be because, I mean, he could face much more serious issues in criminal matters, right?
Yeah, it's no secret. Manafort is wanted for questioning in a Ukraine corruption case. There are also reports the U.S. Treasury Department is looking into some money transfers he's been involved with. So there may be legal reasons why Paul Manafort just isn't ready to go on record anywhere